big round of applause for Cameron.
Throughout history, societies that have come into contact have inevitably formed conflict, be it for resources, land, or just differences in culture. It has simply been a part of human history. Even in our modern, seemingly enlightened age, nations seem to quarrel over the smallest issues. One such conflict was the Korean Expedition of 1871. In 1866, the crew of the General Sherman, a small group of American traders, sailed to Korea to trade with the natives. When denied access to the capital city, the Americans sailed on, breaking Korean law. The Koreans were enraged. They burned the ship and killed the sailors. In response, the U.S. government returned to the nation in 1871, attempting again to open diplomatic relations. After the treaty they proposed was denied and they were told to leave, the Marines invaded, killing hundreds of Koreans in a very one-sided battle. Many other important events were occurring around the time. In 1852, the Japanese made a treaty with the U.S. Years later, the Opium and Civil Wars were taking place. Then, in 1866, the General Sherman incident occurred. 5 years after the conflict, the Koreans were forced to sign a treaty by the Japanese, opening up their trade routes. Our conflict began in 1871. It was centered in Kongwa Island in Korea. The main stakeholders were the United States, who wanted open trade relations, and the Koreans and Japanese, who wanted to be left alone. Overall, this conflict grew into proportion because of the economic desires of the Americans and the cultural prides of both nations. However, the conflict may never have occurred at all if it had not been for the isolationist policies of the Koreans. The first cause for conflict was the economic drive of the U.S. The Civil War had concluded just a decade beforehand. Thus, the U.S. felt behind in their economic development. So, they wanted to open trade with countries in the Orient in order to rise from their economic pit. In order to do this, the Americans showed off their guns to the Koreans to scare them into submission and get them to trade. Another reason for the conflict between the two nations was the pride of their own cultures. Both sides considered themselves superior to the other. The Koreans, noting that they had been around for millennia, considered themselves supreme due to their durability. The Americans, on the other hand, were a young but rather advanced nation. Because of their manifest destiny, they thought it was their calling to spread across the continent and the world. However, without the Korean isolationist policies, this conflict would never have occurred. According to homeoftheheroes.com, the Koreans declared that they had lived for 4,000 years without a treaty with the U.S., and they couldn't see why they shouldn't continue to live as they did. If the Koreans hadn't desired solitude, they probably would have agreed to open trade with other nations. However, this was not the case, and instead they fiercely opposed connections with the Westerners. This mentality was most likely influenced by the interactions between America and Japan in the 1850s, when the U.S. pulled Japan out of their seclusion from the world. So who won? According to the Florida Conference of Historians, the Koreans had at least 240 killed, numerous others wounded, in just one of 3 battles, while the Americans suffered only 3 deaths. But is it just the military victory that matters? Captain James Tilton, in an issue of the Marine Corps Gazette, stated, "Our mission to Korea has been a perfect failure. They won't have anything to do with us." Meanwhile, the Koreans remained a hermit kingdom, achieving exactly what they had desired. So, what can the modern world learn from the conflict of the past? This quarrel is quite similar to the modern intervention of the U.S. in the Middle East. Both involve the United States attempting to change the political lifestyles of other nations just because of its cultural ego. However, America is just making the situation worse. Our country needs to drop out and let the Middle Easterners develop as they please. It's not the decision of the U.S. how they decide to live.